The courtroom was silent, but it was not the kind of silence that brought peace. It was thick, pressing down on every person seated inside, almost suffocating. The heavy oak doors had closed only moments earlier, sealing in the low hum of whispers and nervous coughs. Now the air was tense, fragile, as if even the faintest sound could shatter the balance. At the center of it all sat a child. She was far too small for the witness chair, her tiny legs swinging above the polished wooden floor, unable to touch it. A booster cushion had been placed beneath her, but it still did little to fill the gap between her body and the space around her. She looked lost in the chair, a little doll placed in a setting far too big and heavy for her. The girl was 3 years old. Her dark hair was tied back in 2 loose braids that had begun to fray, strands slipping out to brush against her. Round cheeks. Her eyes, large and brown, darted around the room, never lingering on one face for long. She wore a pale yellow dress, the kind of dress meant for Sunday picnics or family photos, not for testifying in court. Her mother sat only a few feet away, her hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white. She wanted nothing more than to run up to the witness stand and hold her daughter close, to shield her from the stares of strangers, the coldness of the room, and the questions waiting to be asked. But she could not. The law required her to sit quietly, to trust the process, even as every maternal instinct screamed at her to intervene. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a face lined by decades of trials, watched the child intently. His robe hung heavy around him, but his expression had softened. In all his years on the bench, he had seen hardened criminals, weeping victims, and desperate families. But a 3-year-old girl sitting in silence before him, it was different. It was wrong in a way that unsettled even him. This was not the place for children. To his right, the prosecutor shuffled a stack of notes, careful not to make too much noise. The case had been complicated, drawn out by missing evidence, reluctant witnesses, and endless motions from the defense. Yet here it was, hinging on the voice of a toddler. The prosecutor knew the child was fragile, but her testimony, however small, could be the key to unlocking the truth. He glanced at her, wondering if she could even speak under such pressure. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He tapped a pen against his legal pad, watching the girl with a kind of detached calculation. She was only a child. Could her words really be trusted? He didn't say it aloud, but his posture carried the message. She was too young, too impressionable, too unreliable. His strategy was clear. He didn't need to disprove her. He only needed to show doubt. And doubt, in the law, was sometimes enough to dismantle everything. The jury sat quietly, 12 men and women who had expected a case of facts and evidence, not a child in a yellow dress. Some leaned forward, sympathy etched into their faces. Others looked uneasy, unsure how to process what they were witnessing. A few scribbled notes, though what they could write about the trembling of a 3-year-old. Girl was uncertain. The bailiff stood near the door, his posture stiff, eyes scanning the room. And in the corner, sitting just behind the prosecution's table, was the K9 unit. The dog, a large German shepherd, was trained for control and obedience. His coat was thick, black and tan, his body muscled yet calm. He lay with his head lifted, alert but still, his leash slack in the handler's hand. To many in the room, he was just part of standard security, a precaution for a high-profile case. But the child's gaze, flickering nervously from face to face, stopped when it found him. For a moment, her wide eyes settled on the dog, and her breathing slowed. No one noticed it at first. The attorneys were too busy preparing their lines of questioning. The jury was lost in thought. Even the judge had looked down to shuffle a paper on his desk. Only her mother noticed the way her daughter's small, Hands, which had been clenched into fists, relaxed ever so slightly as she focused on the German Shepherd. The little girl blinked slowly, her lips parting as though she might speak. But then she closed them again, shrinking into herself. The prosecutor cleared his throat softly, signaling that they were about to begin. He rose from his seat, buttoning his suit jacket, and walked toward the witness stand. He kept his movements slow, deliberate, trying not to startle the child. "Sweetheart," he began, his voice low and calm, "do you remember me?" The girl did not answer. She stared at him for a brief second, then dropped her eyes to her lap. "It's okay," he reassured gently. "You don't have to be scared. You're safe here." He glanced at the judge, then back at her. "Do you remember why you're here today?" Her little shoulders hunched, and she shook her head quickly, her braids bouncing. The silence that followed was unbearable. It stretched on, filling the room with unease. The prosecutor hesitated, unwilling to push too hard, but knowing the jury was waiting. The mother pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from crying. The judge leaned forward slightly, his lined face filled with a mix of patience and worry. The child's eyes darted again, searching, restless. And then, without warning, they landed once more on the German Shepherd. This time, she didn't look away. Her lips trembled, but her gaze steadied. The dog's ears perked, sensing her focus. A strange stillness settled over the room as the connection grew visible, an unspoken thread between child and animal. The judge noticed it now. His eyes shifted toward the dog, then back to the child. Something was happening, something none of them had prepared for. The prosecutor followed her gaze, surprised. "Do you see the dog?" he asked carefully, testing her reaction. For the first time, her head moved in a small nod. Her mother gasped softly. The jury leaned forward. Even the defense attorney, skeptical as he was, lowered his pen. Silence was no longer just heavy, it was expectant, trembling with the possibility of change. The little girl's hand lifted, her tiny finger pointing toward the canine, and though her voice was still locked inside her chest, something in her expression shifted. The judge's eyes widened, realization dawning. This was not distraction. This was the beginning of something else. The German Shepherd shifted slightly on the polished courtroom floor, his large paws pressing against the cool wood. His handler, a tall officer with calm eyes and a steady stance, kept a firm but loose grip on the leash. The dog had been trained. For countless scenarios, crowds, chaos, sudden movements, but never for a moment like this. His amber eyes locked on the child across the room, his ears pricked forward, reading every flicker of her tiny movements. The little girl, perched awkwardly on the witness stand, kept her gaze fixed on the dog. Her body, which had been tense and withdrawn only moments earlier, began to soften. Her small hands unclenched, her shoulders lowered. She was no longer shrinking into herself, but leaning ever so slightly forward, as though something about the shepherd pulled her out of her fear. The judge noticed first. His sharp eyes, honed over decades of reading people, caught the subtle shift in the child's posture. He tilted his head, following her line of sight. When he saw the dog, his brows knit together in surprise. It was unusual, to say the least, for a witness, especially one so young, to lock onto a police canine in the middle of testimony. But there was something about the way her trembling steadied that made him pause before interrupting. The prosecutor, too, caught the change. He adjusted his stance, glancing from the child to the dog, uncertain whether to continue his questioning or allow this unplanned moment to unfold. He could see the fear that had gripped her melting away, replaced with cautious curiosity. And he knew better than to break it. Across the aisle, the defense attorney sat back in his chair, his pen tapping against the desk. His eyes narrowed. He had prepared for a child too frightened to speak, a testimony too fragile to trust. What he had not prepared for was this: an animal silently unraveling his strategy. He glanced at the jury and saw their faces softening, their bodies leaning forward, already moved by the sight of innocence tethering itself to loyalty. He clenched his jaw. This was not good. The jury itself was transfixed. Their notebooks lay forgotten in their laps as they watched the tiny girl's eyes shine with recognition, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak not to the stern men in suits or the robed judge, but to the animal who had given her something none of them could, a sense of safety. The girl tilted her head, studying the shepherd with the seriousness only a child could carry. To her, he wasn't a police dog, a piece of courtroom security, or a symbol of authority. He was just a dog, strong, gentle, familiar, in a way that reminded her of warmth she thought she had lost. Her tiny feet kicked lightly against the stand, and for the first time since she had been brought into the courtroom, she didn't look as though she wanted to disappear. She looked as though she wanted to reach out. The mother noticed, too. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. She had prayed silently for her daughter to find her voice, to push through the walls of fear that had silenced her since that terrible night. And now, somehow, the answer had come not from a question or from comfort, but from the steady gaze of a German shepherd. Tears welled in her eyes as she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. The bailiff, who had been standing rigid near the door, shifted his stance, curious. Even he could feel the tension in the air changing, softening in a way that made the courtroom seem less like a place of judgment and more like a place of revelation. The dog's handler remained perfectly still, knowing better than to interrupt. He had worked with K9 units for years, but he had never seen a moment like this unfold. The shepherd wasn't moving toward the child, wasn't doing anything extraordinary yet. His mere presence was drawing something out of her that no human in the room had been able to reach. The silence stretched, thick but no longer oppressive. It was filled with anticipation now, a collective holding of breath. Finally, the prosecutor spoke, his voice softer than before, careful not to break the fragile connection. "Do you like dogs?" he asked, his words measured, gentle. The little girl did not look at him. She didn't even seem to hear. Her eyes stayed locked on the shepherd, her lips twitching as though forming words she wasn't ready to release. The dog's ears flicked forward again, his head lowering slightly, as if inviting her to trust him. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge lifted a hand quickly, silencing it. His eyes remained on the girl, his heart unexpectedly tightening in his chest. He had seen so many witnesses falter, so many stories tangled in lies and half-truths. But there was no mistaking the purity of what was unfolding before him. This was not performance. This was not coached testimony. This was something raw, unguarded. The girl leaned closer to the microphone, though no words came yet. She blinked, her lashes wet, her breathing unsteady. And then, in the faintest movement, she lifted one small hand and pointed directly at the German shepherd. The courtroom froze. Every head turned toward the dog. The shepherd remained steady, his gaze never leaving the child. The judge leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's responding." The prosecutor's heart pounded. He knew he had to tread carefully. "Do you want to talk to him?" he asked softly, his tone no longer that of a lawyer pressing for facts, but of a man coaxing a frightened child toward trust. The girl nodded once, small but certain. Her mother let out a strangled sob. One of the jurors covered her mouth, tears glistening in her eyes. Even the defense attorney's pen fell still against the pad, his strategy unraveling in front of him. The child opened her mouth, her gaze never leaving the shepherd. The room leaned in, hanging on the edge of her silence, waiting. Her lips trembled, but her voice did not come out yet. Still, a possibility was alive in the air, more electric than any testimony that had come before. The judge exhaled slowly, realizing what was happening. This was no ordinary moment. This was the beginning of a connection that could change everything: the trial, the testimony, the truth itself. And as the German shepherd shifted closer, his steady gaze never faltering, the little girl's courage began to bloom. For the first time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt hopeful. The child's small hand remained raised, her finger pointing squarely at the German shepherd in the corner of the courtroom. For a moment, no one moved. The sight of that tiny gesture sent a ripple through the room that words could never capture. The prosecutor froze where he stood, halfway between his table and the witness stand. His heart pounded in his chest, each thud reminding him of the fragile importance of this moment. He had seen children testify before, but never one this young, never one whose trauma ran so deep that she had locked herself in silence for weeks. The girl's mother sat rigid on the bench, her breath caught painfully in her throat. She had prayed each night for her daughter to find her voice again. She had whispered reassurances into the child's ear, hugged her tightly through the nightmares, begged silently that anything would bring her back. And now, watching her daughter's trembling finger point toward the K9, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to hope for: release. The defense attorney's lips pressed into a thin line. He tapped his pen against his notepad again, but this time the rhythm was irregular. He leaned forward, trying to appear calm, but unease was etched into his features. He had counted on the girl's silence. Silence was safe. Silence was malleable. But a child who pointed, who might speak, was unpredictable. And unpredictability was dangerous. The jury leaned in collectively, their eyes fixed on the witness stand. They were ordinary people, teachers, retirees, workers, yet in that moment, they all seemed to understand the gravity of what they were about to witness. This was no legal argument. This was no cross-examination. This was something primal. A child finding a thread of courage in the most unlikely of places. The German shepherd did not move suddenly or dramatically. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his ears twitching, his gaze steady. His handler remained perfectly still, every muscle trained not to disturb the fragile balance. To the courtroom, it looked as if the K9 understood that he was not just a dog on duty, but a lifeline to a little girl who had been lost in silence. The judge adjusted his glasses, his weathered face shifting with emotion he usually kept hidden. His bench had said countless testimonies: angry, tearful, reluctant, defiant, but never one like this. He leaned forward slightly, his voice softer than the booming authority he usually commanded. "Go ahead, sweetheart," he said gently. "It's all right." The girl's lips parted, but no sound came at first. She blinked rapidly, her eyes wet, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. For a moment it seemed she might retreat again, folding back into the shell she had carried for weeks. Then the dog gave a quiet huff, not a bark, not a growl, just a soft release of breath through his nose. It was the smallest sound, but it was enough. The little girl giggled. It was brief, almost uncertain, but it was laughter. And in that courtroom, it was a miracle. Her mother's hand flew to her mouth as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. A juror let out an audible sob before quickly stifling it. The prosecutor felt his throat tighten, but he forced himself to stay calm, to let the moment guide itself. The girl leaned closer to the microphone, her small voice trembling as she whispered the words that had been trapped inside her. "Good dog." The sound was faint, almost swallowed by the vastness of the courtroom, but everyone heard it. It was as if those two words echoed against the walls, filling the silence that had weighed on them all. Gasps rippled through the benches. A few hands clutched at hearts. Even the defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, his strategy unraveling in front of him. The German shepherd lowered his head slightly, ears perked, acknowledging her in the way only a loyal animal could. To him, the words were familiar. He had heard them thousands of times during training, during patrols, during moments of duty. But here, now, they meant something more. They were not commands or casual praise. They were the voice of a child who had been too frightened to speak until this exact moment. The girl giggled again, the sound freer this time. Her tiny hand pressed against the wood of the witness stand as she leaned forward, her eyes brightening. "Good dog?" she repeated, louder now, more certain. The judge's hand trembled as he removed his glasses, setting them down on the bench. His throat tightened, but he swallowed hard. "Remarkable," he whispered, though the word was not meant for the record. The prosecutor blinked back the sting of tears. "That's right," he said softly, crouching a little so his eyes were closer to the child's level. "He is a good dog." He glanced at the jury, knowing they had just witnessed something beyond strategy, beyond law. The girl's mother sobbed quietly, shoulders shaking as she covered her face with her hands. She had heard her daughter's voice again, clear, sweet, alive. And in that moment, every sleepless night, every fear, every ache of helplessness felt worth enduring. The defense attorney scribbled something furiously onto his notepad. Though it was clear, his mind was racing faster than his pen. He looked up, scanning the jury, and saw it in their eyes: hope, compassion, belief. It was slipping from his grasp, and he knew it. The German shepherd remained still, his body a solid presence, his gaze unwavering. He had done nothing but exist in that room, yet he had done more for the case than any lawyer could. He had given a voice to the voiceless. The little girl's voice grew steadier as she whispered once more, "Good dog, good dog." Each repetition was like a stone, dropped into still water, sending ripples of relief, hope, and undeniable truth through the courtroom. The judge leaned back, composing himself, though the softness in his eyes betrayed his awe. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said quietly to the jury, "you have just witnessed a child's first words in weeks." The courtroom remained hushed, reverent, as though they had witnessed something sacred. The silence had broken, and with it, the trial would never be the same again. 2 words, just 2, but they carried more weight than all the legal arguments, all the carefully prepared statements, and all the objections the courtroom had heard so far. The sound of the child's voice still hung in the air, delicate yet powerful, like a fragile bird that had finally found the courage to sing. For weeks, she had not spoken a single word, not to her mother, not to her doctors, not to anyone. And now, in front of strangers, in front of the judge and jury, she had broken her silence with a phrase so simple it left the entire room breathless. The prosecutor stood frozen, his pen forgotten in his hand. He had rehearsed his questions endlessly, preparing for every possibility, from tears to silence to confusion. But this he had not prepared for. He had not prepared for a child to bypass everyone in the courtroom and speak only to a dog. Yet as he looked at her wide eyes shining with fragile confidence, he realized that it didn't matter. The fact that she spoke at all was more powerful than any line of questioning he could have planned. The judge leaned back slowly in his chair. His gavel hand rested on the desk, though he made no move to use it. He had presided over decades of trials, heard thousands of testimonies, and listened to countless voices plead, argue, and confess. But never had he been moved like this. The words of hardened men rarely shook him, but the trembling, innocent voice of a 3-year-old calling a German shepherd a good dog? That pierced through the formality of law and struck him somewhere deeper into his humanity. The jury's reaction was immediate. Some covered their mouths with their hands, fighting back tears. Others leaned forward, captivated, their pens forgotten on their notepads. To them, it wasn't just a child's words they were hearing. It was the unmistakable sound of truth beginning to find its way into the open. The defense attorney felt his throat tighten. He tapped his pen against the desk. Too fast now, the rhythm betraying his nerves. He had spent weeks building a strategy. On doubt on the idea that a 3-year-old was too unreliable, too damaged by trauma to testify. But 2 words had just dismantled his entire foundation. Worse, the jury had heard them, and they had seen the effect. He shifted in his chair, his eyes darting between the girl, the dog, and the faces of the jurors. It was slipping away from him, and there was nothing he could do. The girl herself seemed surprised by the sound of her own voice. Her lips trembled as though uncertain she should have spoken, but when the German shepherd's ears perked up and he lowered his head slightly, she smiled. It was small at first, hesitant, but it grew into something brighter. For the first time in weeks, she giggled a soft, airy sound that melted the heaviness of the room. Her mother broke down then. Tears streamed freely down her face, her hands pressed against her mouth as though she could contain the sobs. She had thought she would never hear her daughter's voice again, had feared that the trauma had stolen it forever. And yet, here it was clear, sweet, real. The prosecutor swallowed hard, forcing his voice steady. "Yes," he said gently, crouching to her level so she could see him without feeling overwhelmed. "He is a good dog." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotion in his chest. Do you want to tell him more?" The little girl nodded. She leaned toward the microphone, her voice still trembling but growing steadier with each word. "Good dog," she repeated, then added, "safe." Gasps rippled through the room again. Safe. The word was simple, but it was a revelation. For weeks, she had refused to utter anything, trapped in fear. But now, she was telling them exactly what she felt safe. And not because of the judge, or the attorneys, or even her mother sitting nearby. She felt safe because of the dog. They. German Shepherd gave another soft huff, his chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. His handler glanced down at him in quiet amazement, but made no move to interrupt. It was clear now, the dog wasn't just security. He was part of the testimony. The judge leaned forward again, his voice quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said to the jury, his tone reverent, "what you've just witnessed is extraordinary. This child, who has not spoken in weeks, has chosen this moment in this courtroom to find her voice again." He paused, his eyes misting despite his efforts to remain composed. And sometimes, truth is revealed in the simplest of words. The jury nodded, their eyes shining with tears. Some scribbled the words "good dog" in their notebooks, as though afraid to forget the exact phrase. The defense attorney shifted, uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. He wanted to object, to argue that this was emotional manipulation, that a child's words about a dog had no bearing on the facts of the case. But even he knew it would be useless. No objection could erase the sound of those 2 words echoing through the courtroom. The prosecutor gave the girl a small smile. "Do you want to tell the dog anything else?" he asked softly, giving her control, not pressing her, but opening the door wider. The girl tilted her head, her eyes fixed on the shepherd. Her lips moved again, slower this time, as though forming a memory. "Good dog," she whispered once more, then added in a faint, trembling voice, "He helped." The room stirred. The jurors exchanged glances. The prosecutor's pulse quickened. Helped. Another revelation. Another thread of truth breaking free from silence. The girl giggled again, her tiny fingers curling around the edge of the witness stand. "Good dog," she said one final time, louder now, her voice filled with the innocence of trust. The German shepherd lowered himself onto the floor, his head resting between his paws, eyes never leaving hers. To anyone else, it was a small movement, but to her, it was everything. It was acknowledgement. It was comfort. It was proof that she was not alone. And in that moment, the trial shifted. The courtroom, which had been thick with doubt and silence, was now filled with hope and undeniable truth. The little girl's words, just two small ones, had become the most powerful testimony of all. The judge leaned back, his hand brushing against his gavel, though he did not strike it. He knew this was only the beginning, but already he could feel it. The balance of justice had started to tilt. Two words had done what hours of questioning could not, and no one present would ever forget them. The silence in the courtroom was almost unbearable after the little girl's soft words. "Good dog." Two syllables had shattered weeks of fear and silence. The German shepherd remained steady, its brown eyes fixed on her, its breathing calm. And steady? The judge, jurors, and attorneys leaned forward, realizing that something profound was unfolding before them. For the first time since the tragedy began, the girl was no longer frozen. Her tiny shoulders relaxed as if she had just found a shield in the dog's presence. The moment seemed almost sacred. No one dared interrupt her, not even the defense, who had been waiting for her silence to continue. Then, almost like a dam breaking, the girl's trembling lips parted again. "He madman, he loud." Her little voice was broken, fragile like porcelain, yet every word landed with weight heavier than steel. The court reporter typed furiously, capturing each syllable. Her mother buried her face in her hands, sobbing silently. The prosecutor leaned slightly forward, but didn't ask a question. He knew better. This wasn't testimony to be forced. It was truth unraveling at its own pace. A dog was guiding her in a way no human could. A child's courage in fragments. The girl's eyes never left the canine as she spoke again. "He slammed door. Hurt mama. I hide." Her tiny finger pointed toward the wooden table as though she could still see herself curled beneath it, trembling in the dark. The German shepherd blinked slowly, steady as a rock. It was as if he understood the role he played: guardian, comforter, listener. The girl's small hands gripped the edge of the witness stand, her knuckles pale. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. "I cry. Doggy come. Doggy bark." A ripple went through the courtroom. The jurors exchanged glances. Was she speaking about this police dog, or another dog she had known? The uncertainty made everyone lean closer. Even the defense attorney, who moments before had sat smugly confident, now shifted uneasily in his seat. The judge did not interrupt. He simply folded his hands beneath his chin, his usually stern face softened by something very close to sorrow. The weight of every word, her words came slowly, like puzzle pieces falling into place. Man, bad, he, push, mama scream, doggy, loud. Each phrase was short, broken, yet powerful enough to paint a vivid picture of terror. The prosecutor finally asked, gently, "Sweetheart, do you remember the dog that barked?" The girl nodded, her pigtails bobbing. She turned her gaze fully to the canine seated by the officer in uniform. Her eyes widened, and for the first time since stepping into the courtroom, her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Good dog," she repeated, firmer this time. The jurors collectively exhaled, as though they had all been holding their breath. The defense falters. The defense attorney quickly rose. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The child is not providing direct testimony to questions, but is instead speaking in fragments to a dog. This cannot be considered." The judge lifted a hand, silencing him. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, bore into the defense attorney. "Counselor, this child has been through an unimaginable ordeal. If her words come in fragments, so be it. The court will hear them." The attorney sat down, his jaw tight. He knew at that moment the jury had already begun forming emotional bonds with the child. His cold, clinical arguments would be no match for her fragile bravery. The girl's rising strength. With the courtroom quiet again, the little girl leaned closer toward the microphone. She glanced nervously at her mother, then back at the dog. Her voice rose just slightly. "Doggy, save me. Doggy, chase man." The police officer handling the K-9 straightened in his seat. His dog hadn't been at the original scene of the crime, so what was the girl remembering? The prosecutor allowed the silence to linger before asking carefully, "Can you tell us more about the dog who chased the man?" The girl's eyes darted toward the doorway, as if she could still see the shadow of that night. "Big dog, brown eyes. Like him," she said, pointing again at the German shepherd. "Man, run. I'm not scared." The jurors' faces softened. They could see it, this tiny child, hiding in fear, finding courage in the presence of a dog. Healing through testimony, each word seemed to pull her further from the grip of silence. What had once been unspeakable was now flowing through her, slowly, carefully, but with undeniable truth. She began describing the room, the broken chair, the sound of glass shattering, her mother's scream. Her mother wept quietly, clutching a tissue so tightly it tore in her hands. The judge leaned back in his chair, fighting to maintain composure. In his decades of presiding over cases, he had seen hardened criminals break down, but never had he seen a child deliver such piercing honesty, all because of a dog's quiet presence. The defense attorney looked increasingly desperate, his papers shuffling as though he might find an objection strong enough to stop her, but none came. The girl's voice was too pure, too untainted by manipulation, to be doubted. The dog's silent power, what struck the courtroom most, wasn't just the words, it was the way she delivered them. Every time her voice quivered, her eyes darted to the German shepherd. And every time, the dog's calm presence anchored her, gave her courage, and reminded her she wasn't alone. It was as though the K-9 had become her safe harbor in a sea of fear. He didn't move, didn't break his gaze, didn't do anything but exist for her. And that was enough. The jury could feel it. They weren't just listening to testimony. They were witnessing a bond strong enough to bridge trauma and truth. The breakthrough. Then came the moment that sealed everything. The prosecutor asked, gently, "Do you remember what happened when the man left?" The girl's hands tightened on the stand. Her voice lowered, but the microphone caught it clearly. "Mama cry. I hugged Doggy. Doggy licked me. No more scared." The words were simple, but the power behind them shattered the courtroom's composure. Several jurors wiped their eyes. The judge's throat tightened visibly. The officer beside the K-9 reached down, brushing his hand along the dog's back with pride. The defense attorney sank lower in his chair, realizing the case was slipping beyond his reach. Truth carved in innocence, though the girl never used names, never identified faces. The jury didn't need her to. Her innocence, her honesty, her uncoached simplicity carried more weight than any polished argument could. She wasn't speaking to win a case. She was speaking because the dog had given her courage to let the truth out. And sometimes, truth spoken from the lips of a child carries more conviction than 1,000 testimonies from adults. A courtroom, forever changed by the time the prosecutor said, "No further questions, Your Honor." The courtroom had transformed. It wasn't just about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about witnessing resilience, about seeing courage emerge in the smallest of voices. The little girl leaned back, exhaustion pulling at her. But before she left the stand, she whispered once more. "Good dog." This time, her voice wasn't trembling. It was sure, strong, and filled with the trust of someone who had reclaimed her voice. And as she stepped down, escorted gently by her mother, everyone knew the trial had already turned. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of rigid law and procedure. The air, once thick with tension, had shifted into something far more fragile: hope, vulnerability, and raw human emotion. The little girl sat in her chair, her feet swinging gently as she spoke in her childlike rhythm. Every word was simple, innocent, yet heavy with meaning. And beside her, the canine remained calm, a silent guardian who seemed to understand that his role was no longer about law enforcement, but about giving strength to a soul too young to bear such a burden. The judge, a man seasoned by decades of trials, leaned back in his chair. His gavel rested idle, forgotten for the moment. He watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. His heart moved in a way he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't about rules of evidence, objections, or cross-examinations. This was about truth finding its way out of the darkness in the most unexpected form. A 3-year-old finding courage through a bond with a dog. Across the room, jurors leaned forward as though afraid to miss even a syllable. Hardened men and women, some of whom had sat through gruesome testimony before, now found themselves blinking back tears. One older juror dabbed at his eyes, pretending it was just a cough. Another clasped her hands tightly against her chest. It wasn't just testimony they were hearing. It was a child's attempt to rebuild trust in the world, and no one could remain untouched. The mother sat only a few feet away, her hands clenched together in silent prayer. For weeks she had struggled to comfort her daughter, to coax words out of her silence. But nothing had worked. Therapists, relatives, gentle encouragement, all had been met with the same wall of fear. And yet here, in a room filled with strangers, it was the presence of one dog that cracked the silence. She wept quietly, overwhelmed by both relief and gratitude. Each tear that fell from her eyes was a mixture of pain for what her daughter had endured and awe at her sudden bravery. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. The little girl's words weren't polished testimony. They weren't even direct answers to questions. But the truth embedded within them was undeniable. He knew the jury wasn't listening with the cold calculation of law. They were listening with their hearts. And once the heart made a decision, no legal strategy could overturn it. His client glanced at him, panic flickering in his eyes. For the first time, the defense realized that silence was no longer their ally. Meanwhile, the prosecutor remained still, her eyes never leaving the child. She didn't need to interrupt, didn't need to ask more questions. The child was doing what no adult could have achieved, telling her story in the most unfiltered, authentic way possible. It wasn't about constructing a case. It was about allowing innocence to speak, and innocence spoke louder than any polished testimony ever could. The dog's stillness became the anchor of the room. Every time the girl hesitated, glancing nervously around, her eyes would land on the German shepherd. And instantly she would relax, as if reassured that he was there only for her. She spoke of shadows and loud voices. She described a bad man who frightened her. Her words were fragmented, painted in the colors of a child's memory, but they were sharp enough to cut through the courtroom's skepticism. Each description carried weight, piecing together the puzzle that adults had struggled to solve. The judge took off his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He was not the kind of man easily moved. Years on the bench had taught him to shield his emotions behind a wall of impartiality. But in that moment, impartiality felt almost cruel. He had to admit, silently to himself, that this child had shaken him to his core. He wasn't just witnessing a trial. He was witnessing a moment of human resilience that would be etched into memory forever. The bailiff, a tall man who rarely betrayed any emotion, shifted uncomfortably near the door. He had seen hardened criminals cry. He had escorted victims too broken to stand on their own. But he had never seen a child gather courage in such a tender, unexplainable way. Even he, with his stone-like exterior, felt the sting of tears pressing behind his eyes. The jurors whispered among themselves when the girl paused. The judge quickly silenced them, but he didn't scold. His voice softened as he reminded everyone of the gravity of the moment. The courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment. It had become a sanctuary of truth, a fragile balance between innocence and justice. Every person present could sense it. They weren't just witnesses to a trial, they were witnesses to a miracle. The girl's testimony continued in fits and starts. At times she would pause, sucking her thumb or glancing nervously at her mother. But the moment her eyes returned to the K9, her voice found strength again. She described colors, sounds, and small details only a child would notice: a red cup on a table, a squeaky door, the smell of smoke. Each detail wove together, painting a vivid picture that even seasoned investigators had struggled to capture. And yet, through the fragmented lens of a child, the truth became clearer. Every pause in her story felt like a held breath. Every resumed word was a release. And with each release, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted further away from cold procedure and deeper into shared humanity. People who had come expecting a long, grueling trial now found themselves caught in something far more profound. This was not just about guilt or innocence. It was about witnessing courage in its purest, most unexpected form. By the time the child grew tired, her head resting slightly to one side, the room was silent again. No one dared move, as though afraid to break the fragile spell she had woven. The dog remained at her side, still and steady, as if guarding her words themselves. The judge finally cleared his throat, but his voice cracked when he spoke. He thanked the child softly, not as a judge speaking to a witness, but as a man acknowledging bravery beyond measure. In that moment, the courtroom was no longer divided by roles: judge, jury, lawyers, or spectators. They were united in one shared truth. They had just witnessed something extraordinary. And the K9, silent and steadfast, had become the bridge between fear and courage, between silence and truth. The law would continue. The trial would go on. But deep down, every person knew the outcome had already been written in the heart of a little girl and the quiet strength of a loyal dog. The courtroom remained in a fragile stillness after the little girl finished speaking. Her words, though scattered and childlike, had shaken every soul present. The judge had called for a recess, allowing her to be gently escorted out with her mother, the loyal K9 never leaving her side. As the heavy wooden doors closed behind them, the silence that followed felt unbearable, like the air itself was waiting for someone to breathe again. Jurors avoided each other's eyes, unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. Their notebooks, once filled with scribbled observations, now sat untouched. Nothing they could write would capture the weight of what they had seen. Some clutched their pens tightly, their knuckles white, as though afraid that if they loosened their grip, they might lose hold of the fragile truth the child had laid bare. The defense attorney stood near his table, his face pale, his composure cracking. He had spent weeks constructing arguments, poking holes in evidence, and preparing cross-examinations that could weaken testimony. But how could one cross-examine innocence? How could a child's trembling words, carried on the back of trust in a dog, be dismantled without appearing cruel? He was trapped, not by law, but by conscience. For the first time in years, he realized he was not merely defending a client. He was standing against something much larger: justice itself. And that realization tore at him. The prosecutor sat Quietly, her hands folded, her gaze steady. She didn't smile in victory, nor did she gloat. Instead, she carried herself with solemnity, knowing the power of what had unfolded. She understood that justice wasn't about triumph. It was about truth being seen, heard, and honored. And today, truth had been delivered in its purest, most unpolished form. The child's testimony had cut deeper than any exhibit, any sworn statement, any closing argument she could ever deliver. The judge leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as if searching for strength from something greater than himself. His years on the bench had taught him to separate emotion from law, to weigh facts, not feelings. Yet, as he closed his eyes briefly, he admitted silently that no statute, no precedent, no legal handbook had prepared him for this. The law was often cold, but here in this courtroom, warmth had poured in through the trembling voice of a 3-year-old. It was messy, imperfect, but undeniably real. When court resumed, the jurors shuffled back into their seats, still hushed. The defendant sat rigid, his eyes darting from the jury to the door where the girl had exited. For weeks, he had maintained a veneer of arrogance, smirking at witnesses, whispering confidently to his lawyer. But now his lips pressed into a thin line. Fear had found him. It wasn't the fear of a sentence. It was the fear of being seen for what he truly was. And he could feel that every person in the room now saw him differently. The prosecutor rose slowly. She didn't raise her voice, nor did she embellish. She simply allowed the echoes of the girl's words to carry into her questions for the next witness. Each question was sharp, direct, and deliberate, weaving the child's fragmented story into the larger body of evidence. Her strategy was clear. Let the jury remember that those innocent words aligned perfectly with the facts they already had. The pieces were falling together like a puzzle finally complete. The defense tried to regain ground, objecting where he could, pressing witnesses with skeptical tones. But the jury was no longer with him. Their minds had shifted. Their ears heard his words, but their hearts returned to the image of the child with the dog. Each attempt to poke holes only made him seem desperate, scrambling to pull apart threads that were already woven too tightly to unravel. The truth was no longer just in evidence. It was in the room itself, hanging in the air, undeniable. Outside the courtroom, the child rested in her mother's arms, her head against her shoulder. The canine sat beside them, calm and alert, his eyes scanning the hallway as though guarding his small charge against unseen dangers. Lawyers, clerks, and even strangers passed by with softened expressions. They weren't looking at a witness, they were looking at a symbol of resilience. The little girl, though unaware, had shifted the course of the trial, perhaps even of lives. Inside, the atmosphere grew heavier as closing arguments approached. The prosecutor stood once more, her voice steady but weighted with emotion. She reminded the jury of every piece of evidence, every testimony. She reminded them of the patterns, the facts, the undeniable trail of guilt. And then, with deliberate pause, she spoke of the child. Not in detail, not exploiting her vulnerability, but in the quiet reverence of truth. She told the jury that sometimes justice comes not in loud declarations, but in the whispered bravery of those least expected to speak. The jurors listened, their expressions somber. Many nodded unconsciously, their hands clasped tightly in front of them. They weren't just listening with their ears, they were listening with their souls. Every word carried weight, but it was the unspoken memory of the child's courage that anchored their decision. They had come expecting to judge based on facts alone, but they now knew they carried something greater, the responsibility of honoring a truth spoken in innocence. When the defense attorney rose for his closing, his hands trembled slightly. He cleared his throat, attempting confidence, but his voice betrayed him. He spoke of doubt, of reasonable interpretation, of how memory can falter. He tried to distance the jury from the emotional pull of the child's words. But even as he spoke, he knew he was losing them. His arguments sounded hollow against the image of a child who found her voice not through coaching or pressure, but through trust in a dog's quiet presence. No logic could erase that image from their minds. As he sat down, defeated, silence followed. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of everything unspoken yet understood. The judge instructed the jury with the same legal script he had recited countless times, but even his voice softened. He could sense that this was not like other cases. When the jury left to deliberate, the room exhaled as though it had been holding its breath too long. Hours passed. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, every second a reminder of the weight of their decision. Lawyers paced, families clutched each other's hands, and the defendant stared blankly at the table before him. Outside, the little girl had fallen asleep against her mother, the dog curled protectively at their feet. The world felt suspended, balanced on the edge of a verdict that would decide not only guilt, but the restoration of something far more fragile, trust. When the jury returned, the atmosphere shifted again. Everyone stood, hearts pounding, breaths shallow. The foreman's hands shook slightly as he held the folded paper. The judge asked the question, the words echoing in the chamber. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman nodded, his voice trembling as he read the single word. Aloud, "Guilty." The sound struck the room like a release. Gasps, sobs, and tears filled the air. The prosecutor closed her eyes, her chest rising with relief. The defense attorney lowered his head, knowing there was nothing more to fight. The judge's gavel struck once, but it was drowned out by the raw emotion that spilled through the chamber. In the hallway, the child stirred awake at the sound of sudden commotion. Her mother whispered softly, tears streaming down her cheeks, "It's over, sweetheart. It's over." The K9 remained beside them, steady and unshaken, as if he had known all along how this would end. Justice had been served, not only in the letter of the law, but in the spirit of truth. And at the center of it all was the courage of a child, a bond with a loyal dog, and the reminder that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest weight. The sound of the gavel echoed across the courtroom, sharp but final, like a chapter closing on a story that had been too heavy for everyone involved. The defendant sat pale and defeated, no longer the looming figure he had been at the beginning of the trial. The jury had spoken, justice had been served, and the air in the courtroom seemed lighter, yet the true weight of the moment rested not on the verdict itself, but on what had happened just before it. A 3-year-old girl had broken weeks of silence, and she had done it not for the attorneys, not for the judge, and not even for her grieving mother. She had spoken because of a dog. The judge, a man who had spent decades watching humanity's best and worst parade through his courtroom, found himself sitting in an uncharacteristic silence. His hand hovered near the gavel once more, though there was no reason to use it. His eyes were not on the jury, nor on the lawyers who were already packing away their papers, but on the small girl clutching her mother's hand, and the German shepherd sitting loyally at her side. The dog did not move. He had done his job, in the way only he could, not by barking, not by intimidating, but simply by being present, an unshakable anchor for a child's fragile courage. The judge cleared his throat, but his voice wavered in a way that startled even himself. In all my years of service, I have never seen courage revealed in such a pure form. He paused, his gaze fixed on the girl. This is not just a victory. For the law, it is a victory for truth spoken through innocence. The courtroom was silent, every ear tuned to him. The jury, many of whom still had tears lingering in their eyes, listened as if the trial was not yet over. The attorneys, hardened by countless battles, did not shuffle papers or exchange glances. Even the bailiff stood still. The judge leaned back slowly, his expression softening. Sometimes, he continued, we believe justice only comes from evidence, from testimony, from facts. But today, justice came from trust, the trust of a child and a friend who asked for nothing in return. His eyes flicked toward the canine, whose head was now resting gently on his paws, calm as if the weight of the entire trial hadn't just shifted because of him. The little girl looked up at the dog and whispered again, her small voice carrying, further than anyone expected, "Good dog." The moment cracked something in the room. A few jurors smiled through their tears. The mother wept silently, hugging her daughter close, finally seeing her break through the silence that had haunted her since that awful night. Even the bailiff, a stoic man who rarely betrayed emotion, shifted uncomfortably as if fighting his own swelling feelings. The judge let the silence linger. He wanted it to settle into the hearts of every person present, to remind them that what they had witnessed wasn't just a trial. It was a miracle of human resilience, made possible by the most unexpected companion. The aftermath inside the courtroom. As the courtroom began to empty, people moved more slowly than usual, as though reluctant to leave. The jurors walked out quietly, some placing a hand over their chest as they passed the child. The attorneys gathered their files, but without their usual briskness. They seemed humbled, as if reminded that the law wasn't just about winning cases, but about protecting lives. The dog's handler, Officer Daniels, approached the little girl cautiously. "He likes you," he said gently, kneeling down beside the K9. The girl reached out timidly, her small hand brushing against the dog's fur. The shepherd leaned into her touch, his calmness unwavering. "She hasn't spoken to anyone in weeks," her mother whispered, still trembling. "But with him, she talks." Daniels nodded knowingly. "That's what he's trained for. Not just protection, but comfort." He smiled faintly. He was meant to be here today. The judge overheard the words as he stepped down from the bench. Judges rarely crossed the invisible line that kept them separate from the lives of those in their court, but today that line seemed meaningless. He approached the mother and child with uncharacteristic softness. "Young lady," he said, his voice low but kind, addressing the girl, "you were very brave today." The child hid her face against her mother's shoulder, but she peeked out just long enough to nod at him. The judge felt his chest tighten. He had presided over cases with brutal crimes, chilling confessions, and ironclad evidence, yet nothing had struck him as deeply as the sound of those two simple words, "Good dog." Whispers beyond the court outside, the story was already spreading. Reporters who had covered the trial rushed to capture the remarkable scene, though even they found themselves moved more by the humanity of it than by the headlines. "Child finds courage through K9 in courtroom," began appearing in news feeds within hours. But no headline could quite capture the quiet power of what had unfolded. For those who had been in the room, it wasn't just news. It was something they would carry with them. Jurors would go home and tell their families about the day a child's whisper silenced a courtroom. Lawyers would speak of it long after they retired. And the judge, he knew he would replay this trial in his memory for the rest of his career. The judge's private reflection, later that evening, alone in his chambers. The judge sat in silence, long after the courthouse had emptied. The hum of the city outside his window seemed distant, drowned out by the memory of the little girl's voice. He had built his life on the rule of law, believing that justice came from statutes, from precedent, from the careful weighing of facts. But today had shown him something deeper. Justice at its core came from truth, and truth sometimes needed the gentlest hand to coax it forward. In his journal, something he rarely used except in cases that touched him deeply, he wrote, "Today, justice did not come from my gavel, nor from arguments. It came from a child who found her voice in the presence of loyalty. A dog did what none of us could. Perhaps the law is strongest not when it speaks loudest, but when it listens to the quietest voices. He closed the journal, but the weight of the moment stayed with him. The last goodbye, as the girl and her mother prepared to leave, the little one tugged on Officer Daniels' sleeve. "Can he come home with me?" she asked softly, her big eyes filled with hope. Daniels smiled kindly. "He has a job, sweetheart, but he'll always remember you." The girl hugged the shepherd tightly, pressing her cheek into his fur. For a child who had once been too afraid to speak, her voice now carried with certainty. "Thank you, good dog." The canine lifted his head proudly, as though he understood. The judge, watching from the doorway, felt his throat tighten again. He had thought the gavel's strike marked the end, but in truth, this moment, this quiet exchange of trust and gratitude, was the real closing note. The legacy of that day, in the years that followed, the case became a reference in courtrooms across the state. Lawyers spoke of it when discussing the importance of comfort animals. Law students studied it as an example of how truth could emerge in unconventional ways. And judges whispered of it to one another, as a reminder that their role was not only to enforce laws, but to nurture justice in all its fragile forms. But beyond the legal circles, the story lived on in the hearts of those who had been present. For them, it wasn't about statutes or precedents. It was about a little girl, a loyal dog, and two simple words that changed everything. The judge's closing thought on his final day before retirement. Years later, the judge gave a speech reflecting on his long career. He spoke of difficult cases, of the weight of justice, of the lives changed by decisions made within 4 courtroom walls. But when he came to the story of the little girl and the canine, his voice faltered just as it had that day. "I have seen laws written and rewritten. I have seen truth twisted and defended. But the most honest moment I ever witnessed came from a child who looked at a dog and said, 'Good dog.' And in that moment, justice did not need my gavel. It simply needed us to listen." The room stood in applause, but for the judge, no praise could equal the memory of that child's whisper. And somewhere in his heart, he carried the quiet belief that justice would always find its way, sometimes through laws, sometimes through people, and sometimes through the loyalty of a dog.